Welcome back to the Groundless Ground podcast, the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. You can subscribe to, download, and review the Groundless Ground on iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn, and of course, find out more at groundlessground.com. I'm ready to go. How about you? As Thanksgiving approaches, some of you may be feeling that the current state of our world leaves much to be grateful for, and I get that. This dialogue with Jeremy Lent, a modern-day Renaissance man, is chock full of insight and advice on how individuals can make lasting, positive impacts to shift the current disastrous course humanity appears to be on. Jeremy's book, The Patterning Instinct, investigates the patterns of thought that have led our civilization to its current crisis of sustainability, and his work at the Leology Institute fosters a scientifically rigorous and intrinsically meaningful integrative worldview, one that merges systems theory and Neo-Confucianist and Buddhist philosophies to chart a course of personal and collective action for enabling humanity to thrive sustainably on Earth. This is my gift toward the end of the year, the time when people begin to think about other-centered concerns, care for others, wisdom for oneself. I hope you find this episode useful as well as meaningful. Thank you so much for agreeing to come onto the Groundless Ground podcast and offer the incredible wisdom you seem to be so willing to give.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you. I'm looking forward to it.
So there's so many things you and I can touch on in our conversation today. Leology is something nobody knows what it is because it's your invention.
You're right. It's a new concept. Leology is my offering, if you will, of what could be a worldview for the future. So the actual word leology comes from the traditional Chinese word li, which means the organizing principles of the universe. And the word ology, which is, of course, a Greek-based term, which generally is a suffix meaning the study of. Leology is really like the study of the organizing principles of the universe. But it's not just a cognitive study, but it's an embodied study. It's very much about a framework of integration and of recognizing how there's no separate mind and body. There's no separate East and West. There's no separate science and traditional in terms of the real understanding.
I have no idea if you saw the New York Times last night or this morning. Elon Musk did this interview with the New York Times where he essentially described what happens to so many people who work in this area, in this industry, and completely burn out. So I'm mentioning this because part of your story and how you ended up where you are today has everything to do with the fact that you were in the tech world.
It's true. It's a good point. I was in the tech world, and also, even though I don't know a lot of detail about Elon Musk's life, just judging by his actions and his what he sort of puts out there, I have a feeling that I was also maybe in a similar space to him in terms of having a set of values or sort of living a life that didn't seem to connect with some of the values that I know you hold dear and I hold dear at this point in my life. Seeing somebody who's suffering, wanting to really be in that place of compassion and finding it a little challenging because of all the different unskillful and dangerous ideas that person puts out there in the world in this really big megaphone kind of way, dealing with that challenge of where can I find that path, feeling true compassion in my heart for the suffering this person is experiencing.
After you did a successful IPO, which is everyone's wet dream in Silicon Valley, you did this in 1999, before everybody was doing them.
It's true. I can look back to my own experiences to feel the seed of that compassion and empathy. The first part of my life was spent in business. I got an MBA at the University of Chicago, of all places. Went into consulting and then actually went into the credit card industry, direct marketing of credit cards. Then I actually started this internet company in 1996, which was the first company ever to allow people to apply for a credit card online and get approved in real time and even design your own card, like dragging your image of your family, whatever it might be, onto the card. It was a successful company. within a couple of years, got venture capital financing, as you say, took the company public. I was right in the middle of this crazed maelstrom. Then my life took very drastic turns around. And my wife at the time, her name was Molly, she passed away some years back, developed some quite serious health problems. And I decided to leave. I was CEO at the time to look after her full time. And I left the company when it was really too early. It hadn't really matured. And I stayed on the board, but then I saw the company unravel from this place on the board and ended up going under. And at the same time, Molly, her health problems got more severe. She suffered a lot of cognitive deterioration. So even while I was looking after her for many years after that, my actual only true partner I'd had in my life to that point, I'd lost that person. The company I'd built crashed. The person I'd spent my life loving and being with lost. That was where I underwent really a deep crisis of meaning, if you will. I felt a sense of deep loss. At the same time, I felt a sense of opportunity. Here I was in midlife, and I had the opportunity to direct my life into a path that could be truly meaningful. But my question was, what is meaning? Where does that meaning come from? I'd lived enough in my life to vow not to just accept whatever it was in this kind of path of the search for meaning that I was embarking on. And I wanted it to be something that really felt deeply meaningful to me, but also intellectually I could buy into. I didn't want to play any kind of intellectual games with myself and just accept something on faith. And that led to this path I've been on well over 10 years now, a journey of discovery in terms of understanding where these ideas about meanings come from historically, and also my own embodied spiritual journey. That it's really, at this point, I feel really blessed to have found myself on this path.
There are many people in the world who experience what you experience. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the saying, from suffering comes awakening.
Right.
But there aren't that many people in the world who would take a journey like that and then offer it in a form like the patterning instinct, where you could let others investigate that path of loss of meaning, trying to find meaning in a way that is much more collective. It's unusual, I think, especially the mix of the intellectual, the cultural history, as well as spiritual awakening. That's even more unusual, something I appreciate deeply about your work.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I do sense a couple of things that may be unusual about this book, The Patterning Instinct, that I've written, and the path I'm on in general, is I have had this overriding drive to try to cohere all the different paths of meaning that we see in the world around us now and historically. If I have to sort of use one word to describe what I see as my offering, it's the word of integration, because I've really been striving to integrate different cultural sources of meaning from the past with modern scientific understanding, and integrate a lot of these sort of quote spiritual unquote and scientific, or Eastern and Western, or traditional and modern, mind and body. And there's so many splits that we have in our lives. A big part of my own worldview and my own offering is to show how those all can all be integrated in a connected web of meaning.
Seems like you're very, very insistent that rigorous scientific investigation, the deeper personal investigation of meaning through philosophy, that these two things are not only not separate, but they necessarily need each other for something that ends up being sustainable, which I think is also a very big theme in the patterning instinct.
Yes, that's very true. To summarize what this book, The Patterning Instinct, is about, the actual title of the book itself is The Patterning Instinct, with the subtitle, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. The book looks at the different ways in which various cultures, all the way from the earliest times in human history, have patterned meaning into the universe. I started out looking at our own modern worldview and trying to understand it. If I feel like I want my soul to feel fulfilled, then my first question was, well, what is my soul? So as I started to go deeper in these places, I started to trace these ideas back through Western history to early Greek thought, where so many of these seeds of ideas came, and then began to realize how different other cultural complexes around the world had totally different ways of making sense of things. And I got fascinated by East Asian thought. As I began to go deeper into history, I began to realize you needed cognitive science, cognitive anthropology, cognitive linguistics to understand how our human mind works in order to understand where these ideas of meaning came from. It was really as I went all the way back to early agriculture and then the beginning of human language and the emergence of our human identity hundreds of thousands of years ago, I realized that what makes us unique as humans is really this patterning instinct, this instinct to pattern some kind of meaning into the world around us, to understand how we as humans create different ways of making sense of things. It's not so much to say this one is right and this one is wrong. It's like an invitation, if you will, to us to look at our own worldview, the things that we take for granted, and realize there's other ways that we can actually make sense of things. And then to really understand that these worldviews that have been there in history and that we have right now have implications to them. They're not just there. They actually affect our values, and our values affect what we as a society does to the world around us, which, as I came up to the present day, led to this awakening as to the perilous and potentially catastrophic path that our civilization is on right now, and the need to do something about that. But the need to do something not just at the political sphere or the day-to-day sphere, but at the deepest layers of meaning. Where my book ends up leading is this realization that in order for our civilization to move into a path that's truly sustainable, that can lead for flourishing for humanity into the distant future and for the earth in general, we have to change these fundamental values that we live our lives according to and essentially find a different way of structuring meaning into the universe than our mainstream society offers right now.
I feel like there's been, as you've already stated, these splits. Somehow, the scientific community is attached to an idea because something is mathematically based or follows the laws of physics, that it can't possibly also be functioning on some level that's not quite apparent or fully understandable to the human mind. I think the person who gets closest to this is probably Roger Penrose. I don't know if you know who he is.
Yes.
But he actually has stated that the quantum mechanics that we adhere to and rely on for, frankly, so much now of our technology is a quantum mechanics that's not final. It's probably just the kind of quantum mechanics that we can conceive of at this point in human evolution.
I think that's true. One of the things that I really think is important is to realize that it's not actually the whole scientific community. It's what I call the reductionist group, if you will, or camp within the scientific community. Because the reductionist worldview, if you will, counts for so much of mainstream science that has been popularly put out there, a lot of people conflate scientific with reduction, when that's not actually the case at all. I think that we can define it most valuably in terms of a methodology and a process of approaching things. Establishes hypotheses and then tests those hypotheses. And it's transparent, where when people say something, they open their analysis for others to look at. There is a sense of recognition in this kind of shared understanding and a willingness to change hypotheses if empirical data offer different interpretations, et cetera. So that's scientific method, if you will, which I think we can all be incredibly grateful for. What reductionism says essentially is that you can get the best understanding of things by reducing to its component parts. And you can apply that in biology, you can apply that in physics, you can apply that in chemistry. That has been incredibly successful the last few hundred years in developing the technologies and the scientific understanding we have right now. But it's been so successful that many reductionist scientists have made the mistake of making some ontological leap and then saying, well, because that's so true, that must be the actual what the universe is all about. And therefore, we can say for certainty, as an act of faith, that the universe is nothing but whatever they're going to say. Biology is nothing but the activation of selfish genes, nothing but the DNA molecule doing its thing. Or they can say the universe itself is nothing but quarks and atoms and things just knocking each other around in some sort of random way. So you have somebody like Nobel Prize winner Steven Weinberg talking about how the more we understand about the universe, he says, the more meaningless it appears. So that's the reductionist worldview. But along with that is an equally valid, equally rigorous, equally systematic approach to science that I think can be bundled as kind of systems thinking, if you will, that includes fields like complexity science, systems biology, network theory. You can think of it almost like the sciences of connectivity, which actually uses the same scientific methodology, but in a very different way, and says the connections between things are sometimes equally important and sometimes even more important than the things themselves. And once you recognize that, you come up with a whole different way of understanding things. You look at this notion of reciprocal causality. You begin to recognize this notion of emergence, which reductionist scientists often will poo-poo as some sort of quasi-mystical, non-scientific idea. Emergence is a recognized aspect of a phenomenon that happens when complex systems hit a certain level of size and complexity. But that leads to a very different way of understanding the universe and a very different way of understanding even things like measurements, because within a complex system, you can never truly measure exactly what's going on. You can never truly predict exactly what's going on as you can in a complicated but non-complex system.
I must not have been exposed yet to the scientific view that somehow systems theory is inapplicable and mystical.
I'm always browsing the scientific journals, and it's amazing how much you'll find advanced scientists poo-pooing this notion of emergence. And you'll see this in different fields, physics, chemistry, biology.
So the idea that you can't measure emergence in my field, in psychology, is ridiculous because we actually measure emergence all the time. The psychological studies that are done with self-report measures are measuring emergence of certain shifts and patterns that are showing up in a person's evolution with a specific set of, for instance, interventions or skills. We also do this in family systems therapy, where we are always measuring the emergence of certain kinds of amplifications and bifurcations that occur in the family system when one member might change.
What I have found most exciting about the implications of systems thinking in general is that it allows us to bridge this gap that our Western mainstream thinking has created, what seems like almost like this unbridgeable gap at times between the sort of mainstream sense of science, but it's really that reductionist science I'm talking about, and any sense of meaning in the world. If you go back to some decades, you see somebody like Stephen Jay Gould, who is just this great evolutionary biologist. But he put out this notion of we should have two magisteria, he called them. And one is this kind of science area, and scientists can talk about science, and then let spiritual and religious people talk about that, and they shouldn't overlap. And it was actually called this kind of approach of the non-overlapping magisteria. In this society we live in today, where you have these evangelical Christians arguing against, say, evolution, you can understand where some scientists, at least, would want to sort of put the barriers up so they're not fighting these kind of cultural wars when they're just trying to get a better understanding of scientific insight. The danger with those barriers, it allows this kind of separation of aspects of human identity, which I find is one of the worst underlying phenomena we have within ourselves as human beings and that our culture is experiencing. That's where I feel integration is so important, to connect these things up. My own sort of journey of understanding that we talked about earlier, I went through this. Whatever I wanted to understand needed to be scientifically rigorous. And so I was coming across this kind of Weinberg type of meaningless universe, or the Richard Dawkins and selfish gene kind of theories. Because I wanted to be true to my intellect, I was going, well, I guess I need to take that as a given. But there was something in my spirit, deep inside me, that just knew that wasn't right. And it was really when I came across systems understanding that began to make sense to me. What was so fascinating for me is that I was also doing this cultural historical journey, looking at the underlying precepts like in Buddhism and in traditional Chinese thought. And I began to realize that where systems thinking is going is in fact a domain where a lot of thinkers in the East Asian tradition have been traversing for millennia. And that's where this idea of leology came about, because I began to realize that some of these insights from traditional Chinese thought were actually not just correlated, but almost looking at the same underlying reality that some of the leading modern thinkers in complexity science, trying to understand the philosophical implications of their insights, where they were going. part of my intention going forward is to show how traditional wisdom and modern scientific insights are not looking at different realities at all, but are really using two different lenses to look at the same core intrinsic experience or reality of life as we know it.
So when you say traditional Chinese thought, just so we can be clear with the listeners, are we talking about Taoism and Confucianism?
We're talking about a confluence of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. A few thousand years ago, you had Taoism coming from earliest traditions in very, very early Chinese thought. And Confucianism arose during the Warring States period that was about 2,500 years ago or so. Those two schools of thought were predominant in ancient China. And then, starting roughly around 2,000 years ago or so, Buddhist ideas have a bigger and bigger impact on Chinese thought. Most people are not so aware of what's called the Neo-Confucian tradition, which is something that emerged around 1,000 years ago in China. And what's so exciting about it is that it's what I think is a glorious synthesis of all three of these schools of thought: Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. It's a bit ironic because these philosophers at the time saw themselves as trying to actually reject Buddhist and Taoist ideas and sort of come up with a renaissance of traditional Confucianism. But because Taoism and Buddhism had become so entrenched in the way of thinking in China by that time, what they ended up doing was incorporating all three into this wonderful synergy, if you will, of thought. One of the core underlying precepts of Neo-Confucianism, they looked at the universe as being composed totally of qi. In simplest way, we can just understand in kind of modern scientific terms as energy and or matter. As we know from Einstein onwards, energy and matter are really just two different aspects of the same thing. So if we look at all this kind of qi of the universe, they then added another element to that. They said, well, the ways in which the qi actually connects with itself are these principles of organization. And their word for that was Li. So Li can easily just be translated as organizing principles. The Li determines whether the qi shows itself up as a chair, as air, as a star, or as a human consciousness. It's the different ways in which all the stuff of the universe connect up, which leads to the different manifestations of it. With this kind of concept of Li and Qi, they really formed their understanding from that foundation. As I was reading modern complexity theorists, one in particular, Stuart Kauffman, who's just a great thinker from the Santa Fe Institute, looking at what are the implications of understanding how the universe is comprised of complexity. And he writes books with titles like At Home in the Universe. And there's one part where he's writing, we're discovering these new ways of understanding reality, but we don't yet have the terms. We don't yet have the deeper understanding of how these principles all fit together. And as I was coming across his writing, I was reading these great sages from 1,000 years ago describing the Li. There are these insights as to how these things fit together. And they come from this great wisdom where humans have understood over generations ways of making sense of this connectivity that we can then apply and essentially reinterpret using scientific methodology and scientific terms. Not to lose some of the beauty of that ancient tradition, but to actually sort of recohere it and to establish ways in which we can understand it from a scientific perspective, in addition to that deeper sort of felt wisdom perspective.
I want to be really clear now. We are not talking about the Tao of Physics, which was a book way back when, this attempt to put one thing on top of the other. When I listen to you, I can't help but think the organizing principles, or Li, is a way of describing information. All the quantum computation people I know will readily tell me that all I am is this bunch of information that inhabits atoms and molecules, depending on where I'm going, what I'm doing. That there's nothing solid, particularly about me. It's this information.
Yes.
I feel as though Leology is a way for us to get beyond the split, just to let it go completely and say deeper wisdom is no different than knowing that all I am is computational information that inhabits matter and decides what form I should show up in.
That is such a good point to look at Li in terms of that modern computer science notion, if you will, of information. And in fact, there's times when I've heard leading mathematicians talking about their work, you could almost take the word information, put the word Li in the place of it, and it would sound like we're talking about the same thing. They'll talk about how essentially it's not what the stuff is made of, but it's the information that actually comprises the true meaning about something. What I find interesting is that when people look at things from this point of view of information, it somehow causes them to also get stuck in some kind of reductionist place. They seem to have trouble making this kind of leap from information to a sense of meaning and a sense of deeper connectivity and the implications that arise from that. But I'm not quite sure what that is. And it's something that I want to explore more in the future. Some of the greatest mathematicians of our time will say the universe is comprised of nothing other than information, as this is this great insight. It may be because the word information tends to fall within this notion of computing. And so then it leads to this mechanistic metaphor, which underlies much of Western thought, which is seeing nature as a machine. So if you kind of think of everything as information, then you say, okay, so it's one gigantic supercomputer. And you're caught in this underlying metaphor, which is so powerful in today's world, and I think so dangerous in today's world. Whereas if you just kind of rephrase it in terms of this notion of principles of connectivity, it leads to different ways of understanding things.
So then the bridge you and I are actually talking about now is more a bridge of metaphor. We're still functioning with the same brains we had 35,000 years ago. For us, meaning covers a certain territory that has a feeling to it. And science covers another territory that doesn't quite participate in the feeling yet, I think. But it could.
Yeah, I like where you're going on that. One of the things that I really discovered through applying cognitive science and cognitive linguistics to this history, to the patterning instinct, was the profound importance of metaphor in structuring how we think about things. And I don't know if you and some of the listeners are familiar with the amazing work of George Lakoff, who over the last few decades has established this kind of groundbreaking recognition that all of our abstract thought, all abstract ideas that we have, come from the scaffolding of our embodied experience. Every abstract word that we use is a metaphor. So I can talk about a conversation I had yesterday and say, she gave me a warm smile. And it just sounds very natural, but actually I'm using metaphors right there. She didn't actually give me anything. And the smile wasn't actually warm. It didn't raise the temperature of the room, but I'm using these embodied metaphors because that's the only way in which we humans can actually come up with these conceptual ideas about things. It's amazing when you begin to recognize your own speech and you see all these metaphors are embedded in every sentence. And when you look at worldviews, one of the great discoveries I made really was that every cultural complex has a core root metaphor, if you will, that is the foundation of all the different values, all the different ways they make sense of things. So hunter-gatherers had a metaphor of the universe, which I identified as really nature as being like a giving parent. With early agriculture, you got this new metaphor of nature as really being this kind of hierarchy of the gods, which was a metaphor that came from their experience of hierarchies in their society. But in modern times, ever since the 17th century, the underlying root metaphor that people just take for granted, there's kind of two in a way. They kind of connect with each other. One is nature as a machine. And the other is nature is something to be conquered. This triumphant notion of conquering nature, which has instigated so much positive stuff, but also so much dangerous stuff over the last few hundred years. As an alternative core metaphor, you see in traditional East Asian thought a sense of nature as a web of life. When you look at nature as a web, everything looks very different. Imagine if you're walking in a forest and you see a web connected to a tree. You know that one little drop of water or just one little leaf touching that web causes reverberations throughout the entire rest of that web. And that's how traditional East Asian people thought about the universe, that each action you did had these reverberations. Of course, if you think about nature as a machine, you feel you can like take it apart, put it back together again, make it do what you want, add to it, and also has no feeling. The machine's not going to cry out and say, ow. Totally different way of looking at nature. What I love about the systems understanding of the world is it's really like this recognition, new realization of looking at nature the way that the traditional Chinese understood it all those thousands of years ago.
Yes, theology has a lot to do with bridging this gap in a way that doesn't discount either side, which is what I like so much about it.
Exactly. the sort of integrative approach, and the one that I like to offer through Leology, is that it's not about rejecting any core frame of thinking. It's not even about rejecting reductionist thought. Reductionist science is a key element to so much of what we understand about the world today, and it's incredibly valuable. It only goes wrong when people make the ontological leap of faith to then say it's so powerful that it explains the entire universe.
One of the things I think we need to name and be clear about is that our modern culture, besides obviously being different because our tools are so much more sophisticated, our view of who we are as individuals is also very different than the view of indigenous cultures, the view of even the Neo-Confucians, because these are people who the web of life actually was more apparent to them. They didn't go to a store and just everything was there. They knew the person who slaughtered the animal, or deeper connection with community that I think we're missing in a way where you're going, certainly with a patterning instinct. And I know you're working on another book now. Maybe you're looking more at how all of this warped thinking and being has contributed to our lack of connection.
Yes, I just think that's profoundly true. And in fact, when we look at indigenous or traditional East Asian ways of understanding that sense of identity, the very notion of who I am as a person is very different. A traditional Chinese person will tend to think of herself not as this kind of autonomous individual, if you will, but as one that is identified by relationship with family, relationship with community, relationship with the larger social entities, and relationship with the natural world. And so the sense of identity arises from the relationship. And you see that in indigenous cultures too. And this notion of the individual being something autonomous and separate, you see some hints of it in traditional Greek and early Christian thought, but it really gets much stronger along with the scientific revolution in the 17th century.
And so I imagine you see this as some kind of root problem in the system that's bifurcated us into a direction heading for maybe complete collapse.
Yes, I do think that it is another of these root problems, and these issues we're looking at are all interrelated. If you look at reductionists' approach to biology, saying like this notion of the selfish gene, and you look at the approach of economics, saying that the individual is a rational, selfish maximizer, this is not what Adam Smith said, but it's what modern neoliberals have interpreted Adam Smith as saying. When all these selfish individuals act to maximize their own benefit, that leads to the greatest good for all. We've come to this place of an actual philosophy of selfish individuality, as if it's not just some sort of sacred right to each individual, but it's actually for the greater good of society and the greater good of humanity on the earth. And it's fundamentally mistaken. It's so necessary to get to those underlying roots of the problem and start there when coming up with ways of acting, ways of being that can lead to a more flourishing future. Each of us and within our community, realizing that our very identity is these kind of almost like fractal layers of connectivity, not that we don't exist as autonomous agents untouched by everything else.
So that means we have to go beyond tribalism.
Most definitely. Tribalism, in the way we see it in the world right now, is, of course, one of the most dangerous developments that we're witnessing.
Yes, because we have very sophisticated methods for separation and distinction. We're excellent pattern recognition animals. Unfortunately, we're so good at it. We have this virtual reality machine that's just creating this internal reality with dots that we connect that don't actually exist, don't connect. And therefore, huge swaths of people will fall prey to believing things that don't actually exist or are wholly untrue only because they have such a sophisticated VR machine feeding them a reality, and there's very little capacity to turn outward and embody a reality that might be telling them something other than the separative narrative.
I think that's true. And one of the areas that I've been focusing on more and more in recent times is trying to understand where that came from. And it's not just some of these underlying layers that we've been talking about already on this conversation, but this recognition that in the last 100 or so years, and it's just become even more powerful with the rise of technology in recent decades, is the way in which the sort of global capitalist corporate system actually needs to turn people into consumers in order to keep growing itself and growing shareholder value. One of the things that is so challenging is as infants grow up in the world, they just have exposure to television and then exposure to messages they get on the internet. And they start to identify themselves based on these messages. These messages are not just self-organized ways of humans interacting. They're very much directed by cynical, manipulative, highly sophisticated groups of people working out how to manipulate their very hormonal reactions to what they're seeing or feeling in order to maximize profits. Humans, right from the earliest times, are being sort of molded by our modern society into consumers as their very identity in order to do what the sort of global corporate machine is all about, which is to monetize human activity to the maximum extent. What we see in that, it's almost like this dukkha machine. All the way from the earliest 20th century, modern consumer marketers learned that the way in which we get people to buy products is to make them feel unsatisfied. They must have more, put them on what's called the hedonic treadmill. It's not just accident. You know, you're in the car and you look at big posters or you watch TV and everything looks so attractive and entices you to buy more and to be seen to be doing more, or on Facebook, and you get jealous of these pictures of other people seeming to have so much more fun. These are designed by these consumer-oriented machines to draw us in to the energy we spend, the time we spend, the emotional energy we put into life is towards spending money to make these corporations profitable rather than to find fulfillment for ourselves or healthy community.
Yeah, I actually would like to give a good example of how insidious this is. Also, how unaware, even supposedly aware people are. So this is going to be a controversial example. So right now, there's a very big movement of self-compassion. And I know that your wife, Lisa Ferguson, and I'm not including her in this because, in fact, Lisa actually has envisioned self-compassion in a way that is completely antithetical to what I'm about to describe. Her view of self-compassion is collective and outer directed.
Right.
There is a way in which this whole thing was introduced and is now marketed. You're insufficient. Your view of yourself is insufficient. Therefore, you Western people need to spend a huge amount of time focusing on making yourselves feel better about yourself by applying this self-compassion. They've taken the traditional Buddhist practices, which are geared to cut through the entire notion of selfing and self-obsessiveness and open awareness to the equality of you and everyone else. And you're actually not so special and you're not so wonderful. You're just like everyone else, a human being who intrinsically is worthy of respect and care. And yes, maybe you've not been applying that to yourself because you have a Western mind that's geared for criticality and some self-loathing, much more than has probably been present in Asian cultures for a long time. But still, the antidote to that is not narcissistic self-compassion. It's controversial because, like every psychologist is now out there learning how to deliver self-compassion to their patients, just like mindfulness. Everybody was out there trying to deliver it 5-10 years ago. But it's just a very good example of how something intrinsically good, when it shows up in this consumerist container that you've just pointed to, can be tainted.
Yes, well said. I think that's a great example. And I think that that leads back to this thing we were just discussing a little bit earlier, this sense of the definition of self. When we're looking at self-compassion, the way it's been misused, it comes back to this notion of the self as being this autonomous object, as the person looking at myself. You've written about this a lot. It can be the other extreme, and hating oneself is another form of that sort of self-cherishing, focusing on the sense of identity as being this fixed entity called the self. If you begin to explore the implications of modern systems thinking or the implications of traditional Buddhist notion of interdependence, all the implications of Li, these principles of connectivity, you begin to realize that the self is not actually this separate entity, that it's really this set of connections within this human mind-body organism that's physically I am and each of us is. But even this organism itself is continually arising from these interconnections between things, that the very thoughts I have are not actually my thoughts. in terms of they only came from me, but they're all part of these layers of cultural and interpersonal forms of connectivity over years and years of my life that lead to a particular thought. That every statement I make is not just me saying it, but me putting out these ripples of Li, of interpenetration into the world around. When you begin to realize that, you see your very sense of identity being not just this individual, part of community, part of the earth, part of humanity. And by doing that, it changes this whole notion of compassion. It becomes compassion feelings that emerge within this temporary eddy of Li and energy that we call ourselves. It can also be feelings of compassion that emerge for these interactions that we see around us, for the earth, the hurt that is taking place on the earth right now, because as that sense of identity expands, the sense of compassion naturally expands. Action arises naturally from that. The earth is part of who I am, and the earth is hurting. If I see the earth being ransacked, I'm driven to do something about it.
Yes. And of course, practically, you extend that to areas which are so imminent in our cultural problems: inequity, certainly financial inequity, injustice, social injustice. These are, frankly, key problems that have everything to do with climate disruption, because it's going to be the very people who suffer from financial inequity, injustice, social injustice, who are impacted first and most. Those of us who are fortunate to have means and intelligence, it behooves us to be sacrificial in some way and set aside our own selfish concerns and start to stand up and do something to help nations that may not be around 100 years from now, which sounds crazy, but in fact, it's not.
That's so true. And in fact, even this notion of sacrificial and sort of arising beyond our selfish concerns comes from that fixed Western identity of self. Because as we begin to recognize our actual sense of self as being everything around us, when we begin to make those actions, it's not even having to rise above our own sense of selfishness, but it's actually based on a sense of wanting that enlarged sense of self to be healthier and to be optimized. So it's actually acting on that sense of, I am part of this greater entity. By recognizing that, it naturally leads to this place of action. One of the dangers of focusing on the neoliberal interpretation of mindfulness is it permits people to go into this path of really spiritual bypass. Yes, I really need to work on myself, and things are so bad out there that it really makes me feel bad. And so I really need to put my energy into how can I feel better? Well, there's nothing wrong with recognizing the pain that we experience from looking at what's going on in the world out there, and nothing at all wrong in working on some self-care to actually be more resilient and to enable us to be more active in the world. It's also so critical to realize that true understanding of these things leads naturally to action. There's this wonderful phrase that one of the Neo-Confucian sages says, because they have this notion of knowledge truly being embodied. At one point, one of them says, to know something and not to act on the basis of it is really not to know it. If you truly know something in this embodied way, you have to act on it, just in the same way that you have a reflex. So if you truly know in this embodied way the suffering that is being caused by the sort of neoliberal tyranny that's going on out there and the destruction of the earth that we're part of, then you're driven to act on it. How can I be most skillful? What can I do that can really make the biggest difference to that larger self that I'm part of that's out there?
Where you've gone is the selfish gene motivation is shifted by collective understanding. So now the dopamine hit of helping and being of service becomes the selfish motivation.
That's right. The very word selfish is an interesting word because the gene itself can't be selfish. Once we begin to recognize ourselves as being larger than that independent agent, the way in which the word selfish is traditionally used almost gets to be invalid because it's only based on this core identity of a self as a separate agent.
Some of the research on altruism has delineated two different kinds of altruism. There seems to be an innate altruistic impulse that some animals have shown, as well as infants and toddlers, a natural desire to help. But in our culture, what happens is a second kind of altruism starts to grow that's culturally mediated, and that's the altruism based on the dopamine hit you get when you are helpful. infants and toddlers, they have something in their hand, let's just readily give it to you. But our culture appears to cultivate and inculcate another kind of altruism that is based on this feels good. I'm not sure we can go back to what we come in the world with, but there must be a middle ground between I'm motivated to help because it feels good and what the Buddhists would call non-attachment.
This feeling that you can be with the different layers of it at the same time, that we don't have to be sort of judging ourselves. Because in the end, what actually matters is, are your actions contributing to the greater welfare of society and everything around? And if you're feeling good about your actions, then that will encourage more positive actions to take place.
So I know you're working on a new book. Do you want to say anything about what you're working on?
This new book I'm working on is really the sequel to The Patterning Instinct. When I first did the research for this, it was like about 10 years of research. I envisaged these two books as being one book, but The Patterning Instinct itself was kind of hefty. I realized at some point, no, this has to be two books. If the patterning instinct looks at the different worldviews, the different cultures have had that have led us to this place of profound unsustainability in our modern times, this next book really is about offering a different way of understanding our place in the universe that could actually lead to a more sustainable flourishing for ourselves as human beings and on the earth over the long-term future. The working title of the book is The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. What the book really is about is looking at this kind of deep integration that's possible in just the way we've been talking in this conversation. I'm looking at these fundamental questions that every human being with our patterning instinct at some point ask ourselves, such as, who am I? What am I? Where am I? Why am I? And each section of the book is then devoted to exploring answers to these great existential questions from the point of view of both modern findings in cognitive neuroscience, evolutionary biology, systems thinking, and through the insights that we see from Taoist, Buddhist, Neo-Confucian, or indigenous thought. And then recognizing, interweaving these two so that the answers that arise to these questions are not purely traditional or purely scientific answers, but inextricably linked. It's possible to have a framework of meaning that all of our future scientific research, all of our spiritual journeys can cohere with.
That sounds amazing.
I'm excited about finally getting to the writing for the next year or so. That's where I'm hoping to spend the vast bulk of my time.
Fantastic. Anything we haven't talked about that you'd like to talk about?
Over the last few years, I've held workshops where in community, we can actually explore what are the implications of this kind of integrative way of looking at things. These workshops can include things like guided meditation, dance, discussion, videos, using different modalities to get a truly embodied integrated sense. I'm excited about in the future offering these in maybe sort of broader approaches, maybe on webinars, so that a bigger audience can interact with some of these ideas.
So, will this next book have some of that practical, here's how you can work this particular concept as part of it?
Good question. Not so much. This next book is more like exploration of these ideas with invitations to think about things in certain ways. I do envisage at some point putting out some more sort of handbook-oriented approach.
So, if people want to come experience one of the Leology workshops, how do they find out about it? Where do they go?
Place that people can go to find out a little bit more about Leology right now is the website, which is just leology.org, liology.org. So you can actually sign up on the Leology website to be part of the mailing list. Or you can go to my other personal website, which is jeremylent.com, jeremylent.com. You can sign up to my newsletter there. Once I've got some of these webinars, probably sometime next year, we'll email you to let you know.
Actually, I was going to encourage people to sign up for your newsletter because unlike a lot of newsletters, this is a really useful, vibrant, informational newsletter.
Each time I'll send out a newsletter, which is usually maybe once every 1 or 2 months, I kind of ask myself, am I really offering something of value to people?
One of the things I've been doing recently is asking, do you have any advice to help people navigate the insanity of our current time, particularly what's going on in America?
The best advice I can offer is the advice I offer myself a lot, which is to any extent that we have that kind of enlarged sense of self that we've been talking about in this conversation, probably feeling quite dispirited, demoralized, and sometimes even a sense of despair or hopelessness about where our country is going and where the world in general is going. Just the devastation of climate breakdown and the inequalities and unsustainability. When I get into that place of despair, is this recognition that comes from the system's understanding of the world in general, of the non-linearity of change. The way that the world works is never in this kind of straight line. So if we look in the short term, things happening right now and just draw the line, it can be absolutely terrifying to see where we could be headed. But the non-linearity also means that things can change both for bad or for good. They can change much more dramatically and in unexpected ways than we might consider. It's not something that's happening out there, but it's something that each of us are actually part of. And the choices we make and the ways in which we show up and respond to things going on around us are actually part of that future, whichever way it's going to go. Along with that, we realize that not to do something has the same impact as doing something, and maybe the wrong kind of impact. I find what that gives me is a sense of hope, not the kind of hope that comes from false optimism and say, oh, everything will be okay, or there's 60% probability of whatever. That's not that kind of hope. The hope that arises from a sense of engagement, more like an active verb, and realizing that what we all do, the connections we make, the ways in which we encourage others, the actions that we take to show up actually will impact where we're going as a society and where the human race is headed.
That's so beautiful. And I want to add, it doesn't have to be grandiose. Showing up can be simple, targeted acts that have meaning for you, that have actual effect. Sometimes I think people become so overwhelmed, they feel powerless, they feel helpless because they think they have to do something grand. And
Yes.
again, that's to me just an outcome of the narcissistic view. It doesn't have to be grand, but it does have to be consistent and wise and other directed.
So true. And so important that you say that. Just to add to that, just one more learning that we get from the system's understanding of the world is coming from that nonlinearity is the fact that very, very small changes can actually have amazingly profound impacts. One thing can change something else in another network, that can change something else in another network. And something as small as a smile or a kind gesture to somebody that you give that you don't even remember that you did can have all kinds of impacts that you never even dreamed might be there. And that's another way to remember that we're embedded in this amazingly complex web of life and web of meaning.
And I don't want people to think that you and I are minimizing the efforts we can make just because we want people to feel comfortable. That's not really what either of us are saying right now. We're actually saying the small human mind cannot fully comprehend ultimately the full on ramifications of the acts that we take. Therefore, make sure that we are thoughtful about the acts that we take and that non-harming is always at the forefront of any decision to do or not to do.
That is so true. And maybe just one more thing to add to that is this recognition also that it's not just the acts that we're doing that are making the difference, but the acts that others are doing. And therefore, as important as doing what is core and central to each of our lives and this sense of I've got this particular mission in the world to do this or that is to really look at how can I amplify and build up and support and nourish what those around me are also doing, because it's those connections in that web that ultimately give the power of all of us to really create the future that we want.
And of course, that requires engagement and alignment and interest and curiosity, the elements that we've been talking about that lead to collective well-being or collective mental health.
So true. I so agree.
Well, this has been such an awesome conversation.
Thank you. It's been just a pleasure to talk with you. I think so much rich material we've been covering today.
Thank you so much for taking your time and keep writing. Can't wait to see the new book. Thanks for listening to today's show. To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.